We're living through a period where fear no longer stays inside stories. It moves through the way we watch the world. War and military operations are followed through maps, alerts, expert commentary, and life updates. Economic uncertainty is often discussed like a slow collapse. AI is framed as both progress and existential risk. Cyber threats feel invisible but constant. Even safety, which used to feel like a background condition of ordinary life, now feels less automatic. This is why horror feels unusually close now. Not because people suddenly want darker stories, but because the mechanics of horror increasingly resemble the mechanics of modern attention. Welcome to my podcast. I am Lara Varlamova, a narrative strategist. My background sits in the crossroads of literacy and marketing, and I know how stories shape meaning and how meaning shapes trust and authority. Here, we review cultural and media trends that deserve attention, budget, and belief. And today, we're looking at horror not simply as a genre, but as one of the oldest attention architectures ever created. Before horror became a film category, it was already one of the oldest ways human beings organized fear. Every culture created figures that carried danger on behalf of the community. The ghost gave shape to memory and unfinished business. The vampire gave shape to seduction and invasion. A monster gave shape to what a society could feel before it could fully explain it. That is what horror has always done. It takes fear that feels abstract and gives it a body. This is why horror survives across centuries. It keeps changing its monster because culture keeps changing its fear. When people feared science moving beyond control, horror gave us Frankenstein. When people feared disease, horror gave us vampires and zombies. When people feared the home was no longer safe, horror moved into bedrooms, basements, and nurseries. The creature was never only a creature, it was carrying a larger anxiety. That is why horror moved so easily from folklore to literature, from cinema to television, and eventually into YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, and Discord, and internet-native storytelling. Horror never belonged to one medium. It is attached to something deeper than medium. The human need to recognize threat before the threat becomes fully visible. A good horror story does not usually begin with the monster. It begins with a disturbance. Something feels wrong before anyone can prove what is wrong. The Shining follows the family inside the isolated hotel where the building itself begins to feel psychologically contaminated before the threat becomes clear. The Ring turns a videotape into a curse, making the act of watching media feel dangerous. Paranormal Activity reduces the horror premise to its simple form. A couple records their bedroom at night, and the fear comes from what may be present. That disturbance matters because it activates the audience before the story has fully revealed itself. The brain starts searching for a pattern. It asks what is wrong, where the threat is, and whether it has already arrived. This is where horror becomes one of the most efficient attention systems in the storytelling. It gives the audience enough information to start predicting, but not enough information to feel safe. That gap is where attention lives. And it is also why horror has such unusual business power. The genre often does not need a huge world, a famous character, or complicated franchise architecture. It needs one clear disruption that the audience understands immediately. Halloween did this with the masked figure returning to an ordinary suburb. The film was made for around $325,000 and went on gross around $70 million worldwide. The Blair Witch Project did it with the 3 students lost in the woods and footage that felt like recovered evidence. Its budget was around $60,000, while its worldwide gross reached almost $249 million. Paranormal Activity pushed the model even further. It reportedly cost around $15,000 and grossed around $193 million worldwide, providing that a bedroom and the camera and unseen presence could create more tension than many expensive productions. None of these films needed the audience to study a universe before understanding the fear. The disturbance was immediate. This is what makes horror so efficient. The idea enters the nervous system first, and the explanation follows later. That pattern is still visible now. Obsession, written and directed by 26-year-old Cory Barker, has discussed as a creator-error version of the same horror equation. The film was reportedly made under 1 million, and early reporting placed its global box office around 90 million within about 2 weeks, with later reports moving even higher as the release continued. The exact number will keep changing, but the signal is already clear. Horror still knows how to create disproportional attention from a contained idea. The reason horror holds attention so effectively is not only cultural, it is biological. Fear is one of the brain's strongest prioritization systems. When something might be dangerous, attention narrows, the body becomes more alert, the mind starts scanning for signals. For most of human history, this was survival logic. A sound in the dark mattered, a strange movement mattered, a person behaving unpredictably mattered. The brain learned to treat uncertainty as information. Horror activates that ancient system, but inside controlled frame. The audience feels fear without facing real danger. That is the strange pleasure of horror. The viewer is disturbed, but protected. Physically activated but not actually harmed. The nervous system gets to rehearse danger while still knowing that there's a boundary around it. That boundary is very important. In a horror film, fear has a structure. It begins, escalates, peaks, and eventually releases. Even when the ending remains open, the audience has still passed through a designed emotional experience. But horror does more than produce adrenaline. It turns fear into interpretation. Five Nights at Freddy's is not only about haunted animatronics, it's about childhood spaces becoming unsafe, entertainment becoming threatening, and the fan community turning fragments of lore into a long-running attention system. The fear is simple on the surface. Something that was built to entertain children becomes dangerous after dark. But underneath that, the story works because it corrupts a familiar emotional space. Horror enters by making that comfort unstable. The thing with fears work in a very different way. It is not traditional horror in the usual sense. It uses horror language to make grief visible. A widowed father is stalked by a strange, crow-like presence. The creature becomes a way of showing how loss can enter the home, disturb reality, and become almost impossible to separate from daily life. In one case, horror grows out of games, childhood memory, and online interpretation. In other, horror grows out of grief, intimacy, and the private collapse of ordinary life. But both show the same deeper pattern. The monster is not only there to frighten us, it carries something larger. It can carry grief, it can carry memory, it can carry childhood fear, it can carry the feeling that a place, a body, a screen, or a family is no longer stable. This is why horror creates strong emotional memory. It enters the body first, but it stays in the mind because it means something. As media changed, horror changed with it. Cinema gave horror timing, sound, editing, darkness, and a close-up. Television gave horror recurrence and mythology. The internet changed the genre again because digital horror often does not feel like a story being told. It feels like something discovered. A traditional horror film usually announces itself as fiction. Internet horror often pretends to be evidence. The Blair Witch Project was one of the clearest early examples of transition. Its marketing blur fiction and reality so effectively that the film felt less like a normal release and more like a recovered footage from an actual disappearance. Internet horror pushed that logic further. Local 58 is an analog horror YouTube series that imitates public broadcast emergency messages and local television formats, making official media feel corrupted and unsafe. The Mandela catalogue is built around distorted faces, religious dread, and the fear that human identity can be copied or replaced. The Backrooms transforms a viral internet myth about endless empty rooms into architectural horror, where the monster is not only a creature, but the space itself. This is a very modern fear, not simply that a monster exists, but that a system we use to understand reality may no longer be reliable. The screen is no longer neutral. The archive can be manipulated, the image can lie, the voice of authority can be imitated. The signal can break. Modern horror understands that the fear is not only in content. Sometimes the fear is in the medium itself. Many modern media systems now operate through horror-like emotional mechanics, even when they're not officially horror. A military escalation, for example, is not a horror film, but it can create a horror structure. In modern war and military operations commentary, audiences are often not receiving a finished report. They are watching maps, operational analysis, drone footage, intercepted signals, expert predictions, official statements, and live commentary unfold across television, YouTube, Telegram, TikTok, X. The story is not presented as complete. It unfolds as the continuous uncertainty system. The attention is not held only by what has happened. It's held by what might happen. That is horror structure. The threat is close enough to matter, but unclear enough to keep people watching. AI commentary works in a similar way. When public discussions about AI move from productivity into existential risk, the story begins to resemble a modern Frankenstein narrative. The creator builds the system becomes difficult to interpret, the future accelerates. The fear is not only that the technology exists, the fear is the responsibility may arrive after the consequences. Open AI commentary often follows that rhythm. A new model appears, people test its limits. Experts debate whether capabilities are being underestimated or overstated. The public is left inside a mix of amazement, dependency, and dread. The product demo becomes a prediction loop. Cybersecurity news also behaves like horror. The threat is invisible. The breach may already have happened. The intruder may be inside the system before anyone notices. When ransomware attacks hospitals, pipelines, banks, or government systems, the story is not only technical, it becomes a narrative of hidden invasion. Infrastructure begins to feel haunted by something unseen. Economic collapse creators use another version of the same architecture. On YouTube, entire channels build around housing crashes, debt spirals, recessions, warnings, inflation, anxiety, and the feeling that official indicators no longer match lived experiences. The most effective versions of this content do not always make one specific prediction. They create an atmosphere of approaching instability. That is also why doomscrolling is difficult to stop. It is not passive consumption, it is threat checking. People return to the feed because the story has not resolved. They are trying to understand whether danger is getting closer, whether the situation is getting worse, and whether they can relax. The problem is that modern platforms rarely give full resolution. They are built to keep the loop open. The audience receives enough information to stay activated, but not enough to feel complete. That is the horror loop inside modern media. A threat is introduced, the threat remains unresolved, and the audience returns because uncertainty still feels active. The business lesson of horror is not only that low-budget films can make money. The deeper lesson is that horror is unusually good at building attention before traditional industry infrastructure arrives. This is why the creator economy matters so much for the future of the genre. Cory Booker's obsession became a signal case because it connected low-budget horror economics with online native storytelling. Barker did not build his storytelling language inside the traditional studio system first. He built it online, where pacing, emotional response, and audience behavior are tested directly. For decades, the traditional path was film school, studio access, financing, production, release, and then audience response. Internet native horror often reverses that sequence. A creator builds atmosphere first. The audience responds. The concept becomes culturally legible. Only then does the industry arrive. Kane Parsons shows the same shift through The Black Room. His Kane Pixels YouTube series turned an internet myth into a visual franchise before Hollywood entered the picture. The Black Rooms is built around a fear of endless yellow rooms, light, empty carpet, and the feeling of being trapped inside architecture that feels both ordinary and impossible. This matters because internet horror does not always need plot first. It can build from atmosphere, format, and participation. This is why horror fits the creator economy so well. Internet native horror creators are not waiting for studios to validate the concept. They are building attention first. Then the entertainment industry follows the signal. The future of horror may not belong only to the larger studio budget. It may belong to the storyteller who understands how fear moves through attention loops before the industry arrives. Horror sits close to true crime, but it's not the same thing. True crime is built around real harm. Its attention system is reconstruction. The audience wants to know what happened, who was responsible, and what the evidence shows, what institutions missed, and what the case reveals about human behavior. Recent true crime formats show this variety clearly. American Nightmare turns a kidnapping case into a story about disbelief, institutional failure, and the danger of being treated as unreliable when you're already a victim. Lover, stalker, killer takes dating story and turns it into a reconstruction of obsession, digital intimacy, and real-world violence. The Menendez brothers documentary and the dramatized series Monsters, the story show how true crime now operates across several layers at once: evidence, family history, media memory, public opinion, trauma, and the question of what the audience believes after the case has already been legally decided. These formats invite the audience into a structured reconstruction of events. There's usually a timeline, a victim, a suspect, a system, and the failure, a twist, and the moral question that remains active after the episode ends. True crime turns the audience into investigators. Horror does something different. Horror turns the audience into survivors. True crime asks what happened. Horror asks what's coming. This is the key difference. In true crime, attention is procedural. The viewer follows evidence, timelines, motives, contradictions, and institutional responses. In horror, attention is anticipatory. The viewer stays inside the body's expectations of threat. And that is why true crime holds the mind inside evidence, while horror holds the body inside anticipation. Both genres give audience controlled proximity to danger, but they assign the audience different roles. This is what horror ultimately reveals about the modern attention economy. People do not only stay engaged with what entertains them. They stay engaged with what threatens their sense of safety, meaning, identity, or control. Horror understood this long before platforms did. A horror film knows that attention remains attached to unresolved threat. It knows that the audience will keep watching if the danger is close but not fully visible, if the explanation is partial, and if the next moment might change the meaning of everything that came before. Modern platforms discovered the same principle but without the same boundaries. This is the crucial difference. Horror gives fear a frame. The audience enters the story, experiences the danger, and leaves. The fear is designed. The boundary is part of the contract. The feed does not work like that. The feed does not always build towards release. It introduces threat, keeps uncertainty active, and then offers another piece of content that reactivates the same emotional state. This is why breaking news can feel like a horror sequence. A headline appears before context, a map circulates before confirmation, a video spreads before verification, an expert reacts before the full picture exists. The result is not clarity, it is activation. The same thing happens with AI discourse. A new capability appears, a demo goes viral, a warning follows, and suddenly the audience is inside a prediction loop about the future of work, truth, creativity, children education, and human relevance. The subject may be technology, but the emotional architecture is horror. The threat is not fully visible, the system is difficult to control, the future feels closer than expected. This does not mean fear is always bad. Fear can protect us. It can sharpen perception. It can help us rehearse danger. It can force us to look at things we would rather ignore. But fear can also be extended. It can be packaged, refreshed, monetized, and made continuous. That is the central tension. Horror as a genre gives fear a boundary. Modern media often weakens that boundary, so people remain inside a state that feels very close to horror, not because monster is visible, but because uncertainty stays active. This is why horror is more relevant now than it may first appear. It is not only a genre about monsters, ghosts, demos, or darkness. It is a system that helps us understand how attention behaves when safety feels unstable. In a world where uncertainty travels across screens, markets, borders, technologies, institutions, workplaces, and homes, horror gives us a language for an emotional structure of the moment. The question is not simply why people love horror. It is more about why so many parts of modern media have started to behave like horror. Because horror has always known something that the attention economy now uses every day. The human mind does not look away from a possible threat. It tries to understand it. And if the threat is not fully resolved, it returns. That is the power of horror as the attention architecture. It does not only scare people, it keeps meaning in motion through fear. And in the modern media environment, that may be one of the most powerful systems of all.